I'd be interested in hearing how many people were here when Katrina Spade spoke about this a few years ago. I thought she was intriguing, and we this is how we proceeded with my wife. And I thought, especially for the environmental committee that we were trying to work with, that was really important to be able to hear once again and to emphasize the scientific aspects of the Recompose project. So I'm delighted that Laura Cassidy is able to come today and speak with us, and I suspect you'll have questions afterwards, and we look forward to hearing them as well.
Thank you, Andy. My name is Laura Cassidy. I do outreach and community work at Recompose. I also work with some of our clients as well, so I do a lot of different things within our company, which is great. But definitely a big part of my job is coming to speak to folks like you, and we do tours at the facility. That's something we can kind of put a pin in. If you're interested to come and see our space in person, that's a really neat opportunity as well. And we do a lot of those tours. And just doing a lot of different outreach with different groups of people, again, everybody from hospice nurses to sort of garden clubs and master composters and these kinds of things. And I really enjoy telling the story of Recompose and talking about how it works. And Andy gave me sort of a special challenge in, as he said, really emphasizing the science aspect. Of course, there's always going to be a little bit of science whenever I'm sharing this work with people, but what I did for today is to really kind of lean into some of that science. So my goal is to share with you more of the science and to kind of get a little bit more technical than I usually might. But at the same time, I also want to, my goal is to also stay a little bit more high level so that if any of you are like me and not totally technical and scientific, that it will certainly resonate with you as well. So just know that this is a little different than my usual presentation, again, because I wanted to meet that requirement of really getting to the science side of things. But we'll be about half an hour to go through the presentation, and then when it's over, like Andy said, certainly do some question and answer. That's always a really big part of these presentations, is to get your questions. So you might have came in with questions. You'll probably have questions as I'm going through the slides. If you just save all of those, we'll do that Q&A together at the end, kind of save all of those questions, and we'll do a kind of a Q&A period at the end. Okay. Well, this is our facility. This is Recompose. This is what it looks like when you drive up outside our building. This building is located just south of downtown Seattle, at the sort of Soto, Georgetown neighborhood. And you might look at this picture and think, that doesn't really look like a funeral home. And that's one thing that I do really want you to know, is that we are a full-service funeral home. So when folks work with us, there's no need to work with any other funeral home. In addition to this brand new, really beautiful and environmental care, we also do the work that traditional funeral homes do in terms of, bringing folks into our care, holding them under refrigeration, getting death certificates, and all of these things. So we do all of that work, and yes, we don't really look like what other funeral homes tend to look like. And that's part of our plan, too, is to really redesign what end-of-life care looks like, what it is, what it does, how it lands in our lives, and all of these things. Very much part of the kind of full-scale plan. So to begin our talk, what I want to start with is kind of how all of this came about to begin with. And to tell that story, we have to go back at least as far as 2011. 2011 is when our founder, Katrina Spade, was in architecture school. And architecture school, I always like to kind of pause and remind all of us that architecture school is not just about building these big, beautiful buildings, but it's also about the kind of built systems that we have as humans. So it's not just about, creating structures, but also looking at the systems that we've built for ourselves and sort of saying, do we want to do better? Do we want to do different? So as Katrina was in architecture school, she also had a need in her private life to think about what she would choose between burial and cremation. Of course, those were really the only options at the time. So as she was facing that choice, she really realized that she was pretty frustrated that those were the only two options. She's thinking, how could it be that for our final act on earth, we have to choose something that has some pretty destructive and negative ramifications on the environment? So if we want to look at a little bit more what that means and how to kind of substantiate that idea that burial and cremation are tough on the earth, I made a couple of notes here for us. So in terms of burial, we think about using the land itself, the resources that are necessary to build those structures, to build the caskets, to carry concrete from one place to another. And also our cemeteries are becoming full. So cemeteries just on a land use level alone are a difficult and a sort of a challenge to the environment. A lot of formaldehyde is used in the embalming process. Most folks that are buried are also embalmed. I've mostly got my sources cited here. When I haven't cited my source, it's because this is information that's on our website and is a little bit more common, if you will. But lots and lots of formaldehyde, really difficult, challenging chemicals, are used in the burial process every year. And a lot of wood is used in that casket production. Enough wood is used every year that we could repurpose that wood and build 4 million houses if we weren't using that wood for caskets. When we talk about cremation, we want to talk about carbon and other greenhouse emissions. And we also want to talk about pollutants like mercury that come from our dental fillings. Those are being emitted into the atmosphere. And as well as with cremation, looking at the fossil fuel resources that are used in burning that very, very hot fire. So maybe what we just want to sum up here is that both of those processes have negative impacts on the environment. And if we go back to this kind of origin story, Katrina was just thinking, Recompose founder Katrina Spade was thinking, I wish there was a way for us to take care of our dead and not have these detrimental effects on the earth. So because she was in architecture school, she used that challenge, used that kind of issue and problem that she saw in her own life, and she decided for her senior thesis project, she would look to see if she could find this more environmental solution. Kind of an ambitious student mind frame there to see if she could just come up with a brand new solution, change all of death care in her senior year of architecture school. And the first thing that she looked at as she began her research was natural burial. Natural burial is that process where we place the body really directly into the earth. So without the concrete casket liners, without the big fancy caskets, oftentimes the body is just wrapped in a shroud. Maybe something like a straw basket is used. I have some other details about natural burial here. Again, if we're kind of thinking with a more scientific point of view, we might want to think about some of the other things that happen during natural burial. One thing that's different about natural burial versus more conventional burial is the burial is rather shallow. Instead of going down 5 to 6 feet, the body is buried just about at a depth of about 3 to 4 feet. And this allows greater oxygen flow. And we'll find out later that that oxygen flow is really important to the breakdown of our bodies and any natural materials. Another idea about natural burial is we need really sandy, loamy soil compared to that real kind of clay soil that we get, especially here with all our rain. And that's going to allow for oxygenation, which is also really important to decomposition. And then decomposition within this natural burial framework is largely happens by the microorganisms that are both in our body and are in the natural material. But one thing that we want to talk about, and one thing that Katrina was really mindful of, is there's a big difference between decomposition and composting. When a body is buried naturally, and without all the caskets and these kinds of things, the body will decompose in the ground, but it won't decompose in such a way that that material becomes useful for us. So as we go along with this presentation, when we begin talking about compost, we're really going to zero in on that very nutrient-rich, really valuable material that compost is. And the difference there is that when something decomposes, it doesn't decompose to produce a material that we can then use really as fertilizer or amendment to more growing fauna out in the world. So thinking about decomposition versus composting, and then almost more crucially, thinking about rural areas versus urban areas. Because we just talked about on that earlier slide this idea about cemeteries, they're becoming full. In so many of our urban areas, we just don't have space left in our cemeteries. And so if we think about natural burial and we think about the space that it uses, we begin to think about all the space that we need for housing and hospitals. The land that we have, especially in our urban and suburban areas, we just can't use it for burial, whether that burial is natural or not. So these are some of the key considerations. And remember, Katrina was looking at natural burial, thinking that is a really great process, but it's not quite right for our urban areas. So a big kind of turning point came when somebody told her that within the agricultural realm, it's become very common to compost the large body of a horse or a cow. So in the early 2000s, when we began to see things like bird flu, there was a need for caring for livestock that had died in a cleaner, more safe way. And this is when livestock composting became more and more popular. So again, in those early 2000 years, farmers and agricultural practitioners around the world really began the process of looking more into composting animals. Some facts there on the side that I wanted to kind of point out. Farmers, when this practice began, were using sawdust, wood chips primarily, and you'll see those items come up again when we come into the human composting process, and the nitrogen of the animal body. So composting itself is about carbon and nitrogen. So with the farmers that were practicing this method in the early 2000s, what they really pioneered was this process of using wood chips and alfalfa and straw to supply the carbon, and that the nitrogen would come from the animal body. And that's the same that we're doing with the human composting today. And then crucially, what happens is the microorganisms in that process create heat. They create heat into temperatures of 130 or 150 degrees, and that is what makes the soil safe. So here we're still talking about the agricultural realm and the farmers that are doing this process, and the reason that their soil was safe, and the reason that this process was, kind of became so popular is because just nature alone could create enough heat to create a safe environment, to break down toxins and denature pathogens. That's really beautiful that nature has its own process of doing that without kind of us humans having to come in and add extra heat, by using fossil fuels and things like that. So this turning point of understanding the agricultural composting process was a huge kind of aha moment for Katrina, very important in her research, because she began to realize that if we can do this with animals, if this is being done with animals, then perhaps there could be a direct transfer of that knowledge to humans. And knowing that this was a common practice out in the world, she recognized that what her next step would be to find a great partner who was an expert in this field, and to see if she could work with that partner to transfer that knowledge from the agricultural realm to the human realm. And that's exactly what happened. Here in this picture, the dark-haired person on all the way to, that would be your right, that's Katrina. And then the woman there in the white lab coat is Dr. Lynn Carpenter Boggs. So Katrina found Dr. Lynn Carpenter Boggs, a Washington State University expert in agricultural composting. And she basically called her up and said, you know, I understand the work you're doing with farmers in the agricultural realm, and I'm trying to find a more environmental solution for the human animal. What do you think about partnering? And Dr. Carpenter Boggs said, you know, this is great, because as we've been caring for helping farmers to care for their animals, Dr. Carpenter Boggs said, I've been wondering why we don't do this with people. So they were just a really excellent match with each other. And they designed a study where they took 6 individuals into their care. So they went out into the community. They worked with an organization called End of Life Washington. End of Life Washington is a group that helps folks secure medical aid in dying. And so End of Life Washington has lots of resources. They know of folks who are going to be dying soon, and they connected with those folks to see if 6 of them would donate their bodies to this study that Katrina and Dr. Carpenter Boggs were putting together. So they found those 6 individuals that were willing, again, to donate their bodies to this study, and they also then had quite amount of work cut out for them in getting all of the permissions together from Washington State University. Washington State University had never done anything like this before. And it's one thing to do animal composting, but here they were talking about caring for humans. It's quite different, right? So there was a lot of work involved in getting all of those permissions from the college, and then getting all of the folks together for that study. But once they had those individuals together, and they could bring them into this off-campus lab, part of Washington State, part of Washington State University, they were able to just really rely on all the science and all the expertise of Dr. Carpenter Boggs and her teams. And the beauty of Dr. Carpenter Boggs and her team is they're so familiar with all the EPA guidelines and all the state definitions, and where the state saw the thresholds for clean soil, excellent, safe soil, versus soil that wasn't ready to go out into the world. So using all of Dr. Carpenter Boggs and her team's expertise, they cared for those 6 individuals, and they were able at the end of that study to have soil that met all of the proper requirements for how safe soil is designed by Washington State. And they were able to go to the state government and to show them the results of all of these studies. And in 2019, Washington became the first place in the world to have a framework for legal human composting. So here's kind of that timeline there. In 2018, that was the pilot study that we just talked about with Dr. Lynn Carpenter Boggs. In 2019, the legislation was passed in Washington. And by 2020, the law went into effect, and Recompose became Recompose. We became the first place in the world to take folks into our care and to care for folks using this human composting method. And fast forward to now, actually I need to update that slide. It's 2025 now, isn't it? There are now 13 states that have also passed this law, and several more states that are considering it. So there's legislation all across the country, and there are people all around the world that are also trying to get this care to their communities. So the environmental impact is so promising and so clear and easy to see that there are folks really, again, all over the world that are trying to bring this care into their communities. Because for any one person that chooses this care, you're saving a metric ton of carbon from being released into the atmosphere. And that's a really excellent thing to be to have on our side for any one individual, but it really makes a difference when lots of people are doing it, right? So we're really looking at the whole world, the whole country, wanting to turn that needle so that this care becomes as ubiquitous as cremation. And when that happens, when human composting is the default choice, we're really going to be having a huge positive impact on the earth. So I'm going to kind of now switch into a little bit more everyday science and just lead you through the way that we talk about how this care works at Recompose when I'm not kind of going quite through the same science lens. So in my more everyday presentations to folks, this will be how I talk about human composting and how we share the process with others. So this image here is inside our facility. This is called the greenhouse. So remember I showed you, this is our facility in South Seattle, just south of downtown. When you go in towards the back of that facility, we have something called the greenhouse. And in the greenhouse is this wall of vessels. We call this the vessel array. Something that you might see there is that kind of hexagon arrangement. We live in an earthquake zone, so we had to be really careful about how we're stacking this very precious material. It would have worked okay to do more of a rectangle arrangement, but as it turns out, the bees and their honeycomb design with this kind of more hexagon arrangement is one of the most stable arrangements that engineers are aware of also. And then it has that extra benefit of having that natural, that nod to nature, again, that arrangement has that sort of honeycomb look to it, gives it just the right kind of design for Recompose, because we always want to create an atmosphere and an environment that reminds folks about nature. When you come to our facility, you'll see lots of natural elements, and instead of dark, somber, kind of traditional funeral home atmosphere, our space is very light and bright with lots of natural elements so that we can really continue to underscore how very natural this process is. So again, we start with a mixture of wood chips, alfalfa, and straw, really similar to that agricultural model. The team in the greenhouse, they will be in touch with our services team. They will know about the individual they're caring for. They'll know some basic facts about that person's body so that they can create a ratio of wood chips, alfalfa, and straw that are perfectly matched to that person's individual body. So they'll work with height and weight if that's all they know, but if they have some other information, they can work with that as well. And then they'll create a mixture of wood chips, alfalfa, and straw to perfectly match with that person's body. Here's just a visual of that wood chips, alfalfa, and straw there. And then ahead of what's called the laying in, where the individual goes inside the vessel, the body will be laid on something that we call a cradle. I can show you an image of that. By the way, this is not a person. This is some made out of cardboard and other things, just to kind of mock up the experience so that we have a nice visual for it. But we have the body there laid on something that we call a cradle, and it's getting ready in this image to go into the vessel. In the vessel, we will have laid a bed of that wood chips, alfalfa, and straw. And the individual will then be placed on top of that bed of material. So there's the vessel with the wood chips, alfalfa, and straw. And the body will be laid on top, and the shroud will be removed, and then the rest of the plant material will be placed on top of them. So the body's cocooned in all of that plant material. And over the next 5 to 7 weeks, we can think of that as the active composting phase. So inside that vessel, one individual inside each of these round shields, inside that vessel for the 5 to 7 weeks is the active composting phase. And some of the things that we saw in the earlier slides from the agricultural realm, from this kind of historic application of animal composting, will be taking place there. Most notably, the big important thing is the microorganisms in our body and the microorganisms in the plant material. They work together to create heat. We don't have to heat the vessel. We don't even have a way to heat the vessel even if we wanted to. We have temperature probes that are monitoring the temperature, but the temperature changes all on its own because of the microorganisms in the vessel. So that heat will go up to about 130 or 150, and it will stay there for about 3 to 5, sometimes 6 or 7 days in a row. When it eventually starts to dip again, our team can turn just the inner core of the vessel, and that will increase circulation and the temperature will go back up again. So over the 5 to 7 weeks in that active composting phase, the temperature will go up to 130 or 150 about 5 different times. And each time that happens, that's more toxins are breaking down, pathogens are being denatured. So a lot of times people will still want to ask, what about, if my person died with lots of cancer drugs in them, or what if my person died of COVID-19? All of these things are going to be broken down and denatured because of that high heat for sustained periods of time. And that's just nature taking care of it all on its own. Another thing that we are doing inside the vessel, we are putting air in and taking air out in a constant stream. And we saw that in the agricultural realm as well as in the natural burial realm, where the body is buried at a shallower depth, which allows more aeration. That oxygen is a really important part of the breakdown process. So at Recompose with those vessels, we're putting air in and taking air out. When the air comes back out, it goes up into ducts in the ceiling that have several layers of filters, and that's all in accordance with the Puget Sound Clean Energy Act. So it goes out into the neighborhood after it's passed through several of these filters. And for the first year that we were in business, there was a guy from the EPA who came around to the back of our building where those ducts release the air out into the neighborhood. And his job was to come and smell the air just to make sure that that was all going as it should. And so after a year of coming once a month and smelling the air and, okay, no problem, A plus, A plus, A plus, and he doesn't have to come anymore. So it was kind of a very interesting day when we learned that we graduated out of that process of having that individual come and smell the air. But it's really great to see those different guidelines that are set up and to see how we're able to meet those guidelines and really be in accordance with clean energy, clean air, a process that is really lightweight and positive on the earth. So after that active composting phase inside the vessel, there's a screening process and a sorting process. Lots of folks have, maybe a titanium hip replacement joint or something. During that screening and sorting process, anything inorganic will be screened to the side, and usually those are recycled with a medical recycling company. And then our bones, our large bones and our teeth don't break down during this process, so those will be mechanically reduced, and then there's going to be a kind of a sandy texture that's made up of that calcium and phosphorus, really valuable nutrients, and we'll integrate that back into the soil. That material is a really big part of the nutrient makeup of the compost itself. And then there's a final curing phase for 3 to 5 weeks. So the overall process is 5 to 7 weeks in that active phase, and then 3 to 5 weeks in the final phase. So it's about 2 months for any given individual. Just kind of see these images again. And then what comes is it's quite a bit of soil. I think we were just talking about this a minute ago. Any individual will make a cubic yard of soil during this process. And the reason why we make such a relatively large amount of soil is because we have to use a lot of that wood chips, alfalfa, and straw. For the proper matching of nutrients, we need a lot of that plant material to balance the nitrogen that's in our bodies. A cubic yard is about what fits in the back of a pickup truck. It's 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet. And some people come with a pickup truck and get all of their person's soil. But a bit more common than that is that we'll package it into these double-walled brown paper bags that you see here. We fill those to about 20 or 25 pounds each. And then when all of an individual's soil is in those bags, it's about 25 to 40 of those bags. So kind of no matter how you package it, it's quite a lot of soil. Katrina always tells the story of talking to a community quite like this one early on when she was telling folks about her plan and what she was working on. And a woman in the audience said, you know, Katrina, I don't think my family wants a cubic yard of soil. And she understood that. She had already been thinking about making sure that there were plenty of options for folks to have a really meaningful way to use their soil. So what we have is a really excellent land donation program. We have 3 partners in the region, folks that are doing nonprofit, state or federally recognized work. They're either conserving lands, like sort of saying, you know, here's a wetlands and we're not going to let you build a Walmart there, or they're taking a badly logged area and saying we're going to restore all the ecosystems there. So folks that are just really beautiful and excellent at doing their conservation and reforestation work. And in all the work that they do, they of course need lots of compost. So we have partnered with them, and when families want to, they can donate some or all of their soil to those land donation programs. So what's really common is that folks will take some of their soil, they'll come to Recompose and maybe get 5 or 10 or 15 of these bags and then donate some of the soil as well. And that way they can do some planting projects of their own, as well as contribute to these other really great projects that are going on around the region and keeping our region as beautiful and green as it is. So if we've got some gardeners in the room, this is a slide for you. This is talking about the different qualities of the compost itself. You know, if anyone were to go to the nursery or Home Depot or something to buy some compost or soil, you would want to look for these kinds of numbers and information. So I'm going to let you take a look at those to understand the nutrient levels of the soil itself. And then on the other side of that, we can think of the nutrient value of the soil in this kind of more scientific way. But then we can think about the nutrient value of the soil in a more human way. I like this slide. It just gives one example of many, many examples of ways that one of our clients used the soil that their person produced. So I like kind of ending there and thinking about the nutrient value from a scientific point of view and the nutrient value from a human point of view. And when we think about science, of course, there's lots of different kinds of science, right? And I have always been on the sort of human side of science, the softer side of science. And I think about not only the way that this care works technically, but also the way that this care works in terms of how it shows up in people's lives. And if you were to come to Recompose, we'll take you through a tour of the space. You'll see our ceremonial spaces, the spaces that we have set aside for connection with your person, for saying goodbye, for having that intimate and meaningful process. And I think that's just as important, really, as looking at the technical side of things, is how this care affects us as individuals. And what I see myself is that, you know, there's nothing about our work that's trying to take away the grieving process. There's nothing about our work that's trying to say, you know, we can lessen your sorrow or we can lessen your grief. But what this work does do is add something really beautiful and natural and kind of light-filled to the overall landscape. And that's really what we hear from folks is, amid the sorrow and grief of loss, there is also this really beautiful thing to feel good about, to know that your person is cared for in this highly natural way that's right in step with all of the universe and all of the natural world, and that doesn't cause harm, that rather gives back instead of takes away. So I do really invite you to come into Recompose so we can share more about these spaces for ceremony that we've created. We also have a really great pre-arrangement program. I know at least one person in this room is a member of that pre-arrangement program. I'm happy to answer questions about that. I do have some good brochures, and I even have stickers and buttons if you're interested. And I'm happy to hear your questions. And I've heard them all, so don't be shy.
My wife was put in this process
Yeah.
a year ago.
Do we have another mic? Yeah.
I can take one around.
You go ahead.
Do you have another one?
I do.
I do.
Yeah.
He's
got
got
one
one here.
No,
you keep that one, and I'll take it back from you when you're done.
Okay. I have a question. My wife died just 1 year ago today. Not 1 year ago today. 1 year ago next Thursday. And we are members of Recompose, and we had her go through this process. And I was just curious because I saw that you indicated the materials that are inorganic that you separate out when the process is finished. And I'm wondering, you mentioned mercury, and I wondered what you did with the mercury for...
Dental fillings? Dental fillings, yes. So dental fillings can be recycled as well. So that sorting process is a very hands-on, kind of intensive process. It takes about 4 or 5 of our team, kind of the whole afternoon, to really go through that entire cubic yard of soil, hand sorting dental metal as well as teeth and bones. And so typically dental fillings can be recycled. Every once in a while there's a family that wants those materials back, and that's okay too, but for the most part, we're actually one of the leading medical recyclers in the city. Because of the metal that we return to the medical recycling companies during that process. Yeah.
What is the cost
Yeah.
of Recompose?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. So the cost is $7,000. That includes a couple different things. It's got kind of a whole list in one of these brochures that I have here, but key things that are included in that price are pickup. So we'll go to pick the individual up from whether they're at home or hospital. That actually includes pickup all across the state and even down to the Portland metro area, just if you're got friends elsewhere and you're interested in that. So we'll go bring the person into our care, hold that individual into our care while we're getting death certificates and things like that. And then the majority of that $7,000, we can think about that going to that 2 months of care that's provided during that 2-month process in the greenhouse during the transition itself. And then it also does include packaging of the soil as well as donating the soil if families and communities want that. It doesn't include either of our ceremony spaces because a lot of people choose not to use those, so we don't automatically include those in the price. Yeah.
Our family, when we were choosing this, we examined the price, and we found that they were very comparable. The price for a burial or a cremation was very comparable to what Recompose charges, except that they do it all at once.
Yeah, the national average for cremation is about $7,000. You can certainly pay less for cremation, but if you Google the national average for cremation, it's very comparable. And then burial is typically lots more because you're buying land at that point. So,
my wife was recomposed. In fact, we moved here because she was not well, and then she died. And we had that done. And we took the soil, and we've used it. I still have a plant growing in my upstairs that's Janet. And we took a great deal of that soil, and took it back to Montana, where we still have a place up in the mountains there, and a lot of relatives there. And one day we gave everybody, a quart, 2 quarts, whatever, a container of soil, and everybody took off, and they went back to their cabin, or they went into the woods, or they went somewhere, and they replanted plants that were there, or a tree that they wanted to get planted in their yard or something like that. So we've done all of that the whole time, and it's been just wonderful. Just very, very wonderful. And it's $7,000, as you said. And you're right, it's not any more expensive than the other, but I do recall my mother and father being buried back in Montana, and they were buried in maybe their best clothes. I don't recall it being the best clothes. In a very expensive coffin. And that coffin was then lowered into a pit that was concrete all around it. And they were put in there, and then it was covered over. And that property has never been used any other way since then, and it never will be. And I feel so badly that my mother and father are still stuck in those damn places.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah.
Interest has picked up in this, I think, in the last few years. How many firms are there now in the Washington area that, besides Recompose?
Yeah, there are 2 other companies that I know of that are doing somewhat similar work. They're not in Seattle, but kind of the Kent-Auburn area. So, and then of the 13 states that have the existing law, a couple of those states have the law developed to the point where people can do business there. So that's Colorado, Oregon, and Nevada. And slowly but surely there are a couple of new businesses cropping up in those states as well. But there is a bit of a barrier to getting into this work. You do have to, the vessels themselves and all of this. So one thing that is helping to advance the access to the care is we're creating different affiliate programs with other funeral homes so that they can offer the care to their communities, and then bring their clients to us, and we'll care for them. So we'll probably see that happen more and more as the popularity spreads, as both new companies cropping up as well as a lot of those affiliate programs. And Recompose does plan to spread out and to create new locations around the country. But for right now, we're just pausing and waiting to see, what we believe is the next best move.
As a part of your process, you have a lot of carbon input at the front end. Mm-hmm. If you expand and have a lot of this going, is that input likely to become a problem? And are there any other problems that you would anticipate if this becomes really popular, if this becomes the dominant way of doing it? Do we encounter new problems that we don't encounter when it's just sort of the very minor aspect of, and I'm not that big critical, but often when you scale up, new problems arise.
Yeah, you're right. And I don't know of those. I have not been involved in discussions that are looking at things that we're concerned about in the future. I think that comparison that I made, that each person that chooses this care over burial or cremation, you're saving a metric ton of carbon. So yes, we do use a lot of that plant material on the front end. The electrical and things like that we use is very, very minor. There's a very standard fan that runs. There's some computer, connections so that we can monitor what's going on. But it's so much less than burial and cremation that for right now, all of the conversations that I'm hearing are not concerned with what that's going to look like when it scales. Yeah.
Yes. How are you connected at all, excuse me, with People's Memorial Association?
We are.
Because I've been watching this for 7 years as it's developed.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, I had to register with somebody.
Yes.
And I'm with the Memorial Association, and I can't quite, looking over the material, I can't quite figure out how I switch over to you.
Sure. Yeah, we do have a great partnership with People's Memorial. And so anybody that's a member of People's Memorial is eligible for a 15% discount on our care. So if you decided that you wanted to, prearrange with Recompose or to have, folks in your life take care of that later on, we would just need to make that connection with your PMA membership and you would receive that discount.
No, I'm trying to finish everything before
Yeah.
I slip off. So,
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
And that's the problem, is I'm not quite sure how to do the paperwork.
I can help you with that if you'd like. Yep. Yeah.
What kind of resistance have you received from the funeral industry in America?
Yeah, it's kind of all over the place. There are lots of folks in the funeral industry that are very behind it. They see it as it is. They see that this is the future of care, and they want to get on board to figure out how they can bring it to their communities and their clients. But certainly, there are others who resist the change and dig in their heels, and that kind of funeral lobby group, if you will, is sort of what we're guessing is the reason that the states that have passed the law so far haven't yet put the law into effect, because as we understand it, a lot of these kind of more resistant funeral industry folks are demanding of their legislators more time so that they can kind of figure out how they're going to sort of remain relevant, really, as things begin to change. So we're seeing both that people want to adapt and that people are resistant. And I don't know if this is a good example or not. I think of when, Uber and Lyft and these ride-sharing programs came on, the yellow cabs did the same thing. They sort of demanded some time to figure out how to adjust their business model. So it's change is difficult, is one of the biggest kind of conversations that we have around those that are somewhat resistant to this care. Yeah.
I think you have just partially answered my question. My question is are the churches, particularly the Catholic Church, opposed to it? Because All Souls Day is the day when people come to the grave and they communicate with people who have been buried there in whatever form. And for a long time, the Catholic Church resisted
Cremation. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So in
Yes.
communities, not only here, but in Europe, you're going to have tremendous resistance to that, even though I myself applaud you.
Yes, yes. And when we do talk about kind of what are the main groups of people that are showing any kind of resistance, it is kind of those, let's say old school funeral folks, as well as the Catholic Church is really the one entity that kind of continues to sort of raise their hand and say that they disagree. And they're not making a big fuss about it. They're not, picketing anybody or anything like that, but they're sort of saying their official stance is that, they're not pro. But it's also, I think, really worth noting that they weren't pro-cremation when cremation came on board. So, perhaps that will change. And I would say, certainly, we've cared for lots of folks from the Catholic community, so it's those that really resonate with it and that really feel that it's right. It's not stopping many of them from kind of bypassing that idea coming from
Back
the
here.
church.
Thank you. I have a comment and then a question.
Okay.
To answer to Helen, you are a member of People's Memorial, which you have many options, including Recompose. As she mentioned, Recompose is one of their contracted funeral homes. I can help you with the paperwork. That's what we do. It got your ducks in a row. Not a problem. And just so everybody knows, because Recompose is a contracted funeral home for PMA, you can go onto PMA's website and see the price survey that will tell you what the price is of all options, not just Recompose, but they're competitors and other options. So there was some comments here about the price is the same. It's not actually. There is a difference in price depending on the options, and I encourage you to look on the price list. I completely applaud what Katrina's done. I think it's a wonderful thing. I was on PMA's marketing committee when Katrina was involved in doing that, so I met her many times. And here's my question, which I don't think I've ever heard about. So the cubic yard, that's coming in first, obviously, to recompose. And so the process that you end up with is mostly the materials that actually have been delivered to recompose. So can you tell me a little bit about how that gets to your facility, where it's stored, how often that's delivered? This is, I know, a technical thing, but I've just always been curious about all that organic material that's been brought in, where it's coming from, so that kind of circle of process of the organic material.
Sure, yeah. So the wood chips, alfalfa, and straw, we receive those materials from different places around the region. One of the key ideas there is to have several different suppliers so that we can always keep those stores very healthy. And one of the big goals in partnering with folks and in finding suppliers of those materials is to see wherever we can to interrupt a waste stream, so we can use wood chips, alfalfa, and straw that might not have a way to be used in an elsewise without Recompose using them. So an example of that would be working with sawmills and these kinds of wood fabricators that are having wood chips that they might not otherwise be able to use. That'd be just one example of kind of interrupting a waste stream so that we can have a good home for things that otherwise might not have a use. And in terms of storage, those are stored all in our facility. So the goals around getting those materials into our care or into our facility, into our storage, are to get them as close by as possible from many different suppliers to always be able to maintain that, and then to keep enough materials in our facility to reflect accurately what our capacity is in terms of our clientele and our community. I don't have that number on the top of my head. Yeah.
I have a question. What is your capacity and how busy are you?
Sure. Yeah. So I showed you the one vessel array. There are actually 2 of those. So in total, there's space for 54 of those individual vessels. At any given time, we're about half full. And one of the things that helps with capacity is that not everyone went in at the same day and they won't all come out at the same day. So at any given day, somebody might be placed into the vessel, somebody might be coming out of that vessel, out of the next vessel. So there's always kind of that staggering, and that helps with capacity. But as we continue to grow, we will outgrow even that kind of staggered process, and eventually we'll need to have another greenhouse with more of those vessels. So in that neighborhood that we're in, there's lots of different warehouse buildings, and so we're always kind of trying to keep track of maybe if there are some open available units, and then those vessels are ours. They're designed and engineered for us, by us in the Midwest, and of course that's becoming more and more important to know that we can have something manufactured here in the country and made for us when we need more.
Thanks so much. This is really helpful.
Oh, good.
I wanted to ask, I noticed that the array goes up 4 flights.
Yeah.
So when you're placing the body into a tube, does it go up to the 4th floor, or how do you do that?
Yes. The team there that works in the greenhouse, one of their kind of either qualifications or something that they have to be trained on is using a scissor lift. So when we're using those, what would we call it? Maybe the penthouse level there up at the top. We're using the scissor lifts and the forklifts there in the greenhouse to bring that individual up. And the services team, our team of funeral directors, as well as the soil team that works there in the greenhouse, they work together to do this. I think it's just this very beautifully kind of choreographed process of bringing that individual up in that what we call the cradle, and then bringing them into the vessel. The body goes inside while still on this cradle, wrapped in a shroud, and then kind of all in this very graceful movement. The shroud is removed, and the part of the cradle is taken out, and the rest of the material is placed on top of them. So whether they're doing that kind of on the ground floor or up there in the penthouse, that's their process. Yeah.
Okay, sure. Is there a competing way of burying people by using water?
There is a process called alkaline hydrolysis. That's one word for it. People also call it water cremation. Yeah, I'm not an expert in that kind of care, but it does involve changing the pH level of water, and the individual is placed in something not too unlike the vessels that we use, some kind of vessel-like container, and the water of the pH and the temperature of the water is changed to break down the flesh. And it is similarly a uses fewer resources, certainly. Some of the differences that we talk about and that we've heard others talk about, talking to folks that have maybe considered both options and chosen composting. A lot of folks talk about the fact that you're getting this net gain of beautiful, rich soil. We heard this gentleman talk about what a beautiful process that was to have the soil and to do planting projects. And with alkaline hydrolysis, you wouldn't have that benefit. So that's one difference. And then I have heard some critics of alkaline hydrolysis talk about what that material is doing to the waterbed in the area as that runoff of the water is re-entering, the water table and different runoff streams after the process is over. But I'm not an expert on alkaline hydrolysis, so.
Any other questions? Laura, you had said you had some brochures, is that right?
I do, yeah, I do. I wonder where would be a good place to put those. I could grab this table over here. I'll do that. I'm going to grab this table over here and bring some brochures up. And then if there are questions, I'm happy to answer them. I also have kind of a sign-up sheet. If you want to leave your email address, we can get you signed up to the newsletter. That's kind of sometimes a nice way to stay in touch and to sort of keep it on your radar. But just let me know how I can help from here.
Laura, I thought that was wonderfully interesting, informative, and accessible. Thank you. It makes me even happier that this is what we chose for my wife.